You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 2nd of June 2025 on Monocle Radio. Ukraine and Russia agree a prisoner swap, but little else. Poland does not follow Canada's lead and backs the Maga candidate. And which one do you identify with more, country or city? I'm Chris Chermak. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. My guests Rainbow Murray and Tom Rivers will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from one Thai MP who has outlasted government efforts to ban his political party. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily, and I'm joined today by Rainbow Murray, Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London, and Tom Rivers, former ABC Radio London correspondent. Good evening to both of you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good to have you both here. Tom, I'm going to start with you for this introduction because you were telling me outside about an interesting project you're working on, the revival of Radio Caroline, which is a ship that broadcasts.
Yeah, if you're into it, Chris, you can ignore me for a while, but the ship is an old ship. It's kind of the other ship, the previous ship, the Mi Amigo, sank in 1980. Okay, so the mast was sticking out of the...
To be clear, this is a radio broadcast since like the 60s.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Okay. So it began in 64, it went to 1980, it sank. The replacement vessel is called the MV Ross Revenge, and it's in pretty bad shape. So one weekend a month, the old Caroline gang go out there and broadcast from there, and they try to broadcast to the world to try to get funds for this dry dock operation. And the funds are going up, which is good because it has to go in pretty soon, or it'll eventually sink probably in the river Blackwater, which is off of Bradwell Marina down in Essex. So yeah, I've been hanging out there for a few days. It was great fun out there broadcasting from a ship. If you guys haven't tried it, at some stage you must do. Okay,
you've got to take this Monocle Daily show on the boat road.
Yeah.
Rainbow, you've also been on the road. You were telling me about a visit to Arundel, and we must stress this is not the fictional one that many might recognize.
That's right. Arundel is actually a very picturesque town in the South Downs National Park, but it sounds very much like the fictional home of Elsa and Anna from the film Frozen. So I had to clarify that one for my children, that they were going to see a beautiful castle, but not any Disney princesses.
But there is a beautiful castle. It's nothing to be sniffed at in that sense.
There is a beautiful castle and also some very nice wetlands if you're into ducks.
Okay. I feel like they should go into the fairy tale thing, just live into the name and kind of take advantage of that. Well, we are going to start with what happened, albeit very briefly, in Istanbul today. Officials from Ukraine and Russia met for the second time since 2022 for peace talks that were 2 hours late in starting and lasted about 1 hour in total, offering little, if any, positive signs of progress except for another prisoner swap. The reason for this skepticism might be an audacious drone attack by Ukraine inside Russia over the weekend that saw it decimate about 20% of Russia's nuclear-armed fleet, a humiliation that leaves Russian bloggers demanding a response very much other than peace in this moment. Tom, I want to start with this operation before we get to these talks in a way, because it is so interesting. This was an operation that was more than a year in the making, but the timing of it, nonetheless, is so significant.
The timing is everything. A day before, again, these talks that, people like Trump says, look, I'm willing to help mediate this thing if we can get this thing rolling. But he says, if you guys cannot square the circle, knock yourself out. He says, I'm backing out, and I'm going to take my U.S. tax dollars and walk away too. So, we've had escalations on both sides. This is very much an escalation on the Ukrainian side. The hawks in Moscow are now going to be saying, what do we got in store? Yeah, ballistic cruise missiles, fill in the blank. They're going to be pushing for this not to be a quote-unquote special military operation, But eventually they're going to say, look, if you want total war, you're going to get it.
That is
scary. And we're talking about potentially World War III down the road if cooler heads do not prevail.
Well, to that point of cooler heads prevailing, Rainbow, I mean, when you look at something like this, both sides have been ramping up attacks. Vladimir Putin had also been ramping up attacks on Ukraine. You can look at this in a sort of positive way, silver lining, that they're trying to gain the upper hand in talks that might now be coming. If we were trying to put that kind of spin on it, both sides jockeying for the position, would you say that could be the case?
I would. I'm possibly, and maybe incorrectly, a little more optimistic than Tom. I don't necessarily see this latest attack by Ukraine as an attempt to escalate the war as much as to come to the peace negotiations from a position of greater strength. And it should be pointed out that this mission wasn't to attack Russian civilians, it was to destroy Russian military capacity. It's only a couple of months since that very memorable dressing down of Zelensky in the White House, where he was told quite bluntly, you don't have any cards. And he said, well, I did actually have an ace up my sleeve. And, that mission was 18 months in the making. It wasn't any coincidence that they tried to do that the night before these peace talks, where they have been told repeatedly by Russia and to some extent by the USA to capitulate, that peace means Ukraine rolling over and giving Russia what they want. And what they're saying, I think, is peace, okay, but not entirely on your terms. We also have a say in this.
This is what's so interesting, Tom, because you brought up Trump and you really don't know, I mean, often the case, but also in this case, which way Trump might go. Because on the other one hand, he appreciates strength, to Rainbow's point. He told Ukraine, you don't have the cards. Mm-hmm. This is Ukraine saying, we are a strong power. We can give as good as we get. On the other hand, clearly, as you said, he's at a point where he just wants both sides to stop, and they're not doing it.
Exactly. He's frustrated. We heard quotes from him last week saying Putin, somebody who he thought he could, make a deal with, bargain with, and he says this guy is acting crazy. His words. So yeah, you can see the frustration there. Who might be the referee? Trump could fill that role potentially, where nobody else, Starmer or Macron, could not do that, but potentially Trump can. And I think he's frustrated because he's saying, look, Trump, Putin's not listening to me. Zelensky, he doesn't cut much ice with Trump at all. So he's at a very, very difficult point right now. And we'll see. Something we pulled out at the 11th hour, but as of right now, it looks like they got more pushing and shoving to go, certainly in the coming weeks and months before things may eventually come back around a table, but certainly not for the short term.
Rainbow, what's your sense of how Europeans have also responded to this? They've obviously been backing Ukraine throughout this, arguably more strongly or more specifically backing Ukraine than Donald Trump has at some points. Will this give them hope that Ukraine has maybe a stronger hand than even they thought?
I think so, in the sense that it's difficult to back the powerless party in a power struggle. So seeing your ally fight back, I think, is encouraging. And the message that we're getting consistently from Europe is we need to be stronger. We need to beef up our own defences. We need to stop relying on the USA, and we need to be alert to the genuine threat that Russia poses to us. And we need to be ready to respond if and when that threat materialises beyond what's already going on in Ukraine. So I think any show of strength within Europe, especially from Ukraine, is going to be welcome.
Tom, there is this thing as these ceasefire talks continue with the U.S. again, that there have been these mixed signals about either wanting peace and being fully involved or threatening to completely walk away. Mm-hmm. Can the U.S. really walk away from something like this? Could you ever actually see that happening, or is it more of a threat to try and get...
It's one heck of a big threat, and none of us, I think, at this table would likely see that happen, but it's an option that's on. It's a nuclear option on the table. Let's put it that way. It's inconceivable, but if you're going to throw all your toys in the air at once and get really, really frustrated, it is a possibility, but a very, very remote one.
And Rainbow, just final word on this, but when it comes to these ceasefire talks, there wasn't much today, which is why we're kind of talking more broadly than we are about the talks themselves. But nonetheless, prisoner swaps, that's a start of something, is it not?
Well, we've already had some prisoner swaps, so some more prisoner swaps isn't really anything to get very excited about, is it? I think the bottom line is that most people want peace. I'm not certain that Putin does. I think Putin only wants peace if it's on entirely his terms. And, you know, they did turn up at these talks with a sort of list of demands that no one had a chance to read, as if everyone was just going to capitulate, which they didn't. I think Ukraine wants peace, but they need to be very clear that peace, first of all, can't be unconditional surrender, and secondly, can't be a temporary ceasefire that then leads to further attacks down the road. But I think it's embarrassing to some extent for Trump, because he campaigned saying, I can end this conflict on day one. More than 100 days later, it drags on with no end in sight.
Tom, just final word on that. The fact that he said that he would end it on day one, and now, is that where this threat kind of comes from, that he just would rather walk away?
I think you know, the reality is sinking in and saying this is not the easiest puzzle to work on. But again, he also said, this isn't my war, this is Biden's war. NATO involvement didn't begin 3.5 years ago, as we well know. It began in 2014. All right, 11 years ago. Those of us who covered the fall of the wall, those very heady days that a lot of young people can't remember today. Think back to those days and Gorbachev and James Baker III sitting around in Geneva saying, I tell you what, you can have a whole and united Germany, and it can be in NATO. But that's where it stops. And at that time, roll the clock back, there were 16 countries in NATO. Now it's double that. And those countries are miraculously getting closer to Russia. Russia's not getting closer to them. The club is growing. So yes, there are two ways to very much look at this situation geopolitically.
That is a whole other topic we might have to get into on another show as well. But let's move a little bit westward from Ukraine, because in Poland, the presidential election yesterday has confirmed that conservative nationalism is alive and well. Karol Nawrocki has been elected the country's president, making awkward bedfellows with the more liberal Prime Minister Donald Tusk's government in the country. And it does also suggest that Trumpism has not, in fact, led to a repudiation of alt-right conservatism across the world, just in Canada and Australia, maybe. Rainbow, Donald Trump certainly did not create the European far-right. It has been around for a long time. European nationalism has been around for a long time. But has he boosted it here, do you think?
I think it would be a mistake to overinterpret this result as a ringing endorsement for Trump within Europe. I think in most of the elections that we've seen since Trump came into the White House, or back into the White House, we have seen a rejection rather than a flocking towards the candidate of Trump's preference. And in this particular instance, we saw that it was a very close election, so close, in fact, that it was originally called the other way. It went from sort of 51-49 to 49-51. And so what we're really seeing here is a split. And whilst clearly the candidate close to Trump ultimately emerged triumphant, I think that probably has less to do with Poland's relationship with the USA and more to do with Poland's relationship with the EU, which remains a very contentious topic. Donald Tusk is in favour of the European Union. Of course, he used to be a key political figure within it, and not all of the country wishes to follow him in that direction.
The EU is a contentious topic, but the US as well, Tom, is an interesting one in this region. Rainbow mentions in other regions there has been more of this repudiation of Trump. Eastern Europe, Central Europe is an interesting one, maybe also because of, I remember back in the day of the Iraq War even, the Eastern Europe remembers the fall of the Berlin Wall, as you were talking about before as well. It has backed conservative America. It has backed the United States and its values maybe more than some other regions. Do you get that?
You know, I don't think you have to even go back that far, Chris. I think this is more, and it's kind of, if you will, a shortcut language to say, you know, who's going to be under the wing of Trump in Europe when we have another election somewhere else. And I don't think that's the case. I think it's a pushback against what many people, not necessarily governments, but many people in Europe see as the EU, if you will, technocracy that they're fed up with, that they don't like, that they don't see as totally democratic. And they're saying, look, we like our traditions. Look, we don't like the EU migration policy. And this vote was incredibly close, as you point out, Rainbow. But again, we've seen it, and we've seen that, the changing, if you will, polls, not only in Poland, but certainly Hungary, Slovakia, the Netherlands, Austria. There is a somewhat of a wave, a wind of change. But it's not so much we're doing it because Trump did it. It's because people, the working men and women out there don't like what they've had. And many of them feel that Brussels is shoving rules and regs down their throats, that they have lost control in their local parliaments to control. So they're saying, look, we don't really like the way the game is played in Brussels, and this is indicative of that.
Well, there is a lot of frustration out there, Rainbow, among voters. That's certainly fair to say. And it does, when you see a result like Poland, bring to mind this question at this point of whether these kind of nationalist parties that are now coming into government, what do you actually do with them? Because we've seen this huge divide, right, within countries, but also between Brussels and Poland, or Brussels and Hungary. For me, Germany comes to mind, the opposition AfD. It's the largest opposition, but no other party will work with them. Is that still the right approach, do you think, at this point, when so many of these nationalist governments, nationalist parties are reflecting a frustration of voters?
I mean, there are three approaches generally that mainstream parties can take for dealing with populist parties. The first approach is the traditional cordon sanitaire, which is sort of just repudiate them, have nothing to do with them, reject everything that they stand for. The second is officially reject them, but ape their policies, try to beat them at their own game.
We're seeing an increasing amount of that, aren't we?
We are seeing a lot of that. We are. So yes, Keir Starmer's very rightward shift on immigration, I think, is a clear example of that approach. And then the third approach is to openly embrace them and work with them. And we are seeing some political parties, especially on the right, attempt that approach as well. Generally, the middle approach, the try to beat them at their own game, it doesn't work, because what you're doing effectively is validating their messages and saying that their approach is correct. And if people hear two different messages, one from the party from which it originated and another from a party trying to copy them, they're going to go with the original, not the copy. So that approach doesn't work. So I think you either have to decide we're willing to go full hog and embrace them as part of the democratic process, or we're going to continue to offer an alternative and say this version doesn't work.
Tom, you said before that something like Poland is about the frustrations of voters towards the European Union. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we saw, for example, CPAC Poland for the first time this last week, bringing CPAC, this conservative sort of traditional annual conference from the US, from DC, to Poland. It's also in Hungary. You saw Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem appear. They're endorsing the nationalist candidate in Poland. So that would suggest there is, if voters aren't voting on sort of U.S. policy and Trump, at the very least, the U.S. is trying to influence what's happening here too.
Trying to influence. I hearken back too. I think it insults a lot of local voters when an American senior figure comes over and tries to persuade them. Look, it's like, you got your own patch, you solve that puzzle, we're going to figure out our own. You think back to a couple of days before Brexit. Who came over? Barack Obama, and said, if you vote to leave, you're going, in his words, to the back of the queue. All right? Nobody says that in America. And the Brits go, on your bike, buddy. We don't want to know about your opinion. We will figure this. We're voting, not you. Have a nice day. So, I think that really doesn't cut a whole lot of ice in the views of many, many European voters. If a senior American comes over, or a senior figure from another country comes over and jumps on the campaign trail, it really doesn't do a heck of a lot, I don't think, for that particular party.
Rainbow, just final word on this. To that point, maybe, can nationalist and populist parties even work together? Because there is that question, of course, that if you are about making your own country great, how do you then actually go about helping another country make itself great as well?
Of course, there's a natural tension there, isn't there, between a party that's nationalist and inward-facing and a sort of internationalist approach. But it's worth bearing in mind that nationalists tend to have a shared ideology on a number of things. They like to have strong frontiers and borders. They're often quite socially conservative. They have shared visions on what a global economy should look like, broadly speaking. So even if they want to focus each on their own nation, they like it when other nations around the world are sympathetic to that perspective and running along similar lines. And it's also worth bearing in mind, I mean, as Tom said, the USA has very long been somewhat imperialist, not trying to take over other countries, but certainly very keen to engage with them from a position of power, influence them.
So in many ways, Rainbow, many under the table, but that's another discussion.
Yes, so I think the idea of countries keen to work with like-minded leaders elsewhere is nothing new.
Well, let's move on, and pun intended, because if you are considering new places to move to and your job does not keep you in one place, this may be the discussion for you, because Tulsa, Oklahoma is among those cities that offers an incentive of $10,000 for people to move to their fine city and boost the local economy. I guess if you don't have a beach or lakes to draw people in, you have to go with old-fashioned bribery. But the point of this story is actually a study that's showing that this sort of bribery does actually offer a worthy return on your investment. More than 3,400 people have been paid to move to Tulsa, and the initiative has returned 4 times that amount in investment back into the local economy. Tom, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. Are you a fan of paying people to move to your place?
I found it absolutely fascinating, because in this day and age, a lot of people work remotely. So you can be in Havre, Montana, working remotely, or you can say, why don't you work remotely in Tulsa, and if you hang around for 12 months, we'll put a check in your pocket for 10 grand. And a lot of people are saying, yeah, that's not bad. I might check that out. And it's totally novel. The research hat that you wear, Rainbow, I think you're going to be fascinated to see how this thing plays out. When I read this one, I said, I come from the Rust Belt. And a lot of those towns, little towns where I came from, bigger towns, mill towns, big urban centers that used to bolt cars together, all 3 of those different levels of towns, they're about half the population that they were in the 1950s. And if you're from there, if you're young, and if you can, you get out of there. You don't hang around. So a lot of these towns see a lot of social decline, property decline. A lot of houses get knocked down, torn down. The prices of those houses are very, very low. Why? Because who's going to move there? Well, if you have an incentive like this, maybe there's a reason to come there and maybe build up the small economy as well on Main Street, which has been decimated in many of these locations. So, yeah, I think it could. Watch this one closely. If it works there in drill part of America, it might work in the Rust Belt, where I come from as well. And it might be a good model. Wait and see.
That is such an interesting point, Rainbow, because we have seen through remote work, people are moving around, but, there are obvious places that benefit. Portugal benefits a lot from people wanting to move to, the sunny Mediterranean. But then you have these kinds of places. You have places that have suffered with the Rust Belt. You've seen this also in, say, Italy, southern Italy, all these towns that have kind of disappeared, lost their populations, trying to bring people back. What do you make of this kind of effort to convince?
Yeah, I think it's a viable option for places that have faced population decline, that are trying to bring people back in, that perhaps have a surplus housing stock and have capacity to expand. Bearing in mind that you are trying to recruit people to your town that already have jobs. So you don't need to create those jobs for those people. They come with a job in their pocket, and then they have the income to spend within your town that then creates jobs for the people who are already there. So it's an interesting way of expanding your population and also expanding the jobs for that population. It's obviously a very different story if you're talking about locations that are already struggling with capacity and infrastructure and don't necessarily wish to expand further. But I think it's a reflection of the modern world that you're not necessarily having to recruit the employers anymore, because you can get their employees without them. You can just get the sort of the mobile units that are people working remotely. So I think it's a novel way, a creative way of trying to draw people with employment and wealth back to those locations. It really stands the test of time whether this is going to be an enduring trend of population redistribution.
Well, Tom, to that, just one more word on this. What's interesting as well, to that point of like some cities being at capacity, do we maybe talk a little too much about that these days with the immigration debates? It feels like we're always talking about being full. We don't actually talk about those cities, like you say, the Rust Belt, that actually need people.
Some of the engineers that I used to work with came from up north. And again, as you point out, Rainbow, a lot of these communities, you roll the clock back, they were the linen capital of England once upon a time. They were a coal mining area. And it's sad because I know in the States, I come from an iron mining area. It's sad when you look at these places because they weren't like they were when you look 100 years ago, and they're not like they were 50 years ago. And unless something dramatic is done, in my part of the world, it's called the Iron Range Rehabilitation Group. It kind of looks at it very, very differently, and they've had very, very mixed results over the years. And they're saying, well, if you're not going to be mining as much as you used to, what can we put? Let's put a yo-yo factory. No, it doesn't work. It does not work that way. But maybe, just maybe, this financial incentive might be the silver lining. That's why I say, watch this one 4 or 5 years down the road, see where it goes.
Well, speaking of cities making people feel right at home, if you live here in London, the odds are you feel more of a connection to the city than to the country. A survey by YouGov has found that 38% of respondents here felt a strong attachment to London. Only 29% felt similarly connected to England. London may be unsurprisingly the only place in Britain to put city before country. But for our panel, I do want to ask this, and I'll start with you, Rainbow, because you are from, as you have told me, London, Greater London. What is your sense? Do you put London before England?
Well, I mean, London, first of all, it's a very international city. So I think there are a lot of people who are Londoners who aren't necessarily English in the classic sense. It has always attracted a very large migrant population. That's part of London's strength. It's part of what makes it the unique and wonderful place to be that it is. And so it doesn't surprise me that some of those people might feel a greater sense of attachment to London than they do necessarily to the country in which it's situated. On a personal note, I've always lived a little outside London, and I prefer London to be a place that I go into rather than a place where I'm based all the time. We said at the start of the show that I'd been to Arundel, so I spent a few days surrounded by sheep and rabbits, and on the train journey back, coming into Victoria, suddenly there were many, many, many people, many, many buildings. Everyone was jostling and shoveling, and I thought, I'm not sure that this is for me. But I think for people who like to have everything on their doorstep, London is truly a global city, and I can understand why many people thrive here.
But just to follow it up, Rainbow, does Greater London not count as London for you? You don't consider yourself from London if you're in the suburbs?
I consider myself to have the best of both worlds. I know a lot of people think suburbia is boring, so I'm not necessarily representative of the world here, but I like to have easy access to a city that I'm not forced to spend my entire time in.
Tom, what's your sense of London as one of those people who has come here from elsewhere? Are you a Londoner? How strong is your attachment?
I am a Londoner. What can I say? My first job on Fleet Street was for United Press International, which was about a 1-minute walk to Samuel Johnson's house. Okay, it used to be behind the wine press, and next to it that time, if you go back far enough, it was LBC was located there. But anyways, And Samuel Johnson said it best in 1777 when he said, when a man is tired of London, he is tired of life. For there is in London all that life can afford. Amen. He said it all.
That's it.
That's
I
it.
agree 100%.
There you go. Yeah.
Is there any other place like it for you, Tom?
I like visiting other places, but I mean, day in, day out, what can't you do in London?
That is a very positive note to end on. Okay. Rainbow Murray and Tom Rivers, thank you very much for joining us. Now, finally on today's show, since the military coup of 2014, Thailand's democracy has been left with a constitution that concentrates power amongst unelected institutions. The country's Move Forward party became a significant victim last year when it was dissolved by the Constitutional Court despite winning the most seats in a general election. Among the MPs that survived the dissolution through the new People's Party is Parit Wacharasin, who now sits in the House of Representatives in a government that has tried to get rid of him. Monocle's contributor Gunnar Grunlid sat down with Wacharasin at the Oslo Freedom Forum and began by asking him to give some context to Thailand's political situation.
So, I mean, in a nutshell, I think Thailand is probably a flawed democracy. So we have supposedly transitioned into a democracy 93 years ago. But since then, we have been interrupted by a series of military coups. The latest one happened in 2014, so almost exactly 11 years ago today. And even though the military regime is no longer in place, the country has been returned to elections. But what the military regime left us with is a constitution that is currently in place right now. And it's a constitution that is not democratic by global standards. What it basically does, it expanded the power of many unelected institutions, such as the unelected Senate, such as the Constitutional Court, such as the various so-called independent organizations in Thailand. And these organizations and institutions have been given more power to override or even contradict the will of the people that's expressed through the ballot box. And we see many examples of this over the past 2 years. For example, firstly, at the 2023 election, the Move Forward party that I ran with and another party called Per Thai, who stood together in opposition to the military government. Together, we got more than half the seats in the House of Representatives. In a normal democracy, you would become in government. Mm-hmm. Right? But the Constitution gave the power of unelected senators to also have a say in who becomes prime minister. So even though we got the majority of MPs, because we did not get enough support from these unelected military-appointed senators, we eventually were forced into opposition. And since we've been in opposition, our party has also been dissolved by the Constitutional Court.
Dissolved entirely, yeah.
Yes, so we now have to set up a new party called the People's Party, and the MPs that survive from Move Forward then, kind of immigrate into the People's Party.
When you say survive, it's not the case that everyone from the previous party got to just rebrand and keep going, so to speak. Not everyone survived the transition.
Not everyone. So whenever the party dissolution happens in Thailand, the executive members of the party are also banned from politics. So that will include, automatically the party leader, who was also our PM candidate, as well as the Secretary General and a lot of our other MPs. But those that remain can kind of go into a new party, a new vehicle heading in the same or having the same target and ideology.
You're now in the House of Representatives as someone from a party that's been dissolved and had to be rebuilt and restructured. What is political debate actually like in the House of Representatives in sort of a government that has continually dissolved you and tried to keep you out?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair to the current government, and I think this speaks a lot about the complexity of our political system, is that the dissolution probably didn't happen at the discretion of the government. But what we have in the Constitution is that there are certain institutions that are not elected, but have a lot of power and wield a lot of influence in Thailand. So the Constitutional Court, dissolved our party, probably without the governing party's knowledge or involvement. But it just shows that the battle in Thailand is not just between elected parties in parliament, but it's also between elected institutions and appointed or unelected institutions. So despite the ideological differences that we have, and of course we've been very, very critical of the current government in not pushing through the necessary democratic transition or democratic reforms, but what we have always tried to communicate with them is that we need to work together. Even though we, sitting on the opposite side of the aisle, at least one thing we have in common is we are all elected. So we need to, make sure that we at least collaborate in ensuring the will of the people is not overridden by unelected institutions.
So in terms of debate in the actual government, there's actually a lot of good faith between the parties and the process works more in general?
I'm not sure I would classify as so much so as good faith. No. We do have a lot of policy and deep-seated ideological differences. But I think given the special nature of Thai politics, there are certain areas that we need to work together across the aisle.
Well, and are you optimistic in terms of the way it's progressing? I know you mentioned on stage that it was quite a huge moment earlier this year when same-sex marriage was legalized. So do you see a sort of general work in progress it's going in the right direction? Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I don't think I can be too optimistic or too pessimistic. I think we hope same-sex or equal marriage will be an important first step towards a set of other progressive reforms. But so far, that has not really been the case. And we see that other reforms that we've been calling for example, an end to mandatory military conscription, has not really progressed. Our calls for decentralization has not really been answered to. But I think overall, if I put it in a nutshell, the current state of Thai politics is like a tug of war. So we have, on the one hand, a political system that is increasingly regressive. And our constitution right now is less democratic than what we had 30 years ago. But on the other hand, we have a society that is increasingly progressive and increasingly demanding of democracy. That's why we saw high voter turnout. And a lot of that support comes from the youth, which gives me a lot of optimism because it means that they also wield a lot of influence in terms of getting our message across to their parents and grandparents. When the election happened, and we had a lot of young supporters who were helping us out in terms of convincing their parents and grandparents. I used to say jokingly, it's almost like we have a supporter in every single household, almost a representative of our party in every single household trying to get our message across. So that's kind of what we are seeing right now, a tug of war between a regressive system pulling us back and a progressive society pushing us forward. We just have to hope that we can maintain that momentum, ensure that people don't lose hope. And I think one day we can lift that progressive system and move it forward with us.
Thai politician Parit Wacharasin there in conversation with Gunnar Grunlid. That's all the time we have for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to my panellists Rainbow Murray and Tom Rivers. Today's show was produced by Carlotta Rebello and Tom Webb and researched by Francesca Jilks. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Chris Chermak here in London. The Monocle Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.